You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I am Dustin, and joining me as always is Tony, and we are here to talk about our next current state of, which this time around we're going to be talking about HBO Max. HBO Max is an interesting service because unlike the past services that obviously already exist, and the ones that are about to launch in the coming months, there is HBO Max and Peacock, which is the one we'll be covering the next time around. But HBO Max and Peacock, we have just a very little amount of information. We don't actually have a ton of information for HBO Max. We don't have price, we don't have the exact release date, but here's what we do know about HBO Max. HBO Max is obviously deriving from the company where HBO is located, which is WarnerMedia. WarnerMedia is owned by AT&T. If you look at AT&T's value, because WarnerMedia no longer has stock or anything like that, the current stock price is $37, and they have a value of $531 billion in assets. As I said, the price is unknown. The service itself is set to launch in early 2020, according to everything that has been said. Originally, it was meant to launch at least in beta by the end of 2019, but that's not happening. But we'll get into some more of how this service has morphed into more from one thing that they originally announced into something that is completely different than what they originally announced. But the other date to keep in mind is October 29th. It is actually, there's plans to have some sort of reveal on the Warner Brothers lot for HBO Max, which I'm assuming they're going to roll out prices. They're going to roll out the actual plan for it, and they'll probably announce a release date, because their goal, by all accounts, is to get this released as early in 2020 as possible, but they also want to make sure that they're out there before Peacock as well, because they're already going to have Disney Plus and Apple TV Plus, and obviously the existing players of Amazon Prime Video and Netflix already out in the market for them to have competition. So they need to at least get out there and not be the last of the major studios that are pushing a service. They need to be out there and available for people to get to check out before they become the last, basically an afterthought. So October 29th, we'll have more details. Obviously, I would just probably assume at this point that we will probably have an episode releasing the next day, if not the day right away, once they announce this stuff, talking about everything that they announced for HBO Max, because we'll be getting into our news episodes here very shortly. So with that being said, the one thing that we want to dive into first is, well, we've done this for at least a couple of these episodes, disclaimers. So as a disclaimer, the last... it's almost 13 years. That's a long time. For the last 13 years, I have ran a website called thebatmanuniverse.net, where it's all about Batman. And as many of you may know, but some of you probably don't, Batman is owned by WarnerMedia, so I'm very up to date with a lot of the things that's happening within the confines of Warner Brothers, because of the stuff that I cover for this other site that I presently work on. Tony and I actually met through this other site. He works and reviews comics for that site as well and writes articles. So that's how we met. So we have experience with at least some of the products that WarnerMedia has. Also, there's a ton of services that we'll talk about in a little bit, one of which is DC Universe, which we are also familiar with as well. So that all being said, we have some experience with HBO Max, or not HBO Max, but WarnerMedia as a company. So there's that. But the other part of it is that Warner Brothers has a massive, massive library, very, very close. I honestly could say that it might be even more extensive than what Disney has in the sense of just the sheer output, not necessarily the sheer quality of content. But Warner Brothers, they produce and distribute a lot of television shows, while Disney does have television shows. They have not had that as a major focus for the company over the past 15 years. And on top of that, while they own ABC, a lot of the shows that were on ABC prior to Disney owning ABC, a lot of those shows were not actually produced by ABC. So there's a lot of content on top of that. Warner Brothers also owns the MGM library pre-1970, I think it is, because of some deals that happened with Turner Communications in the 80s. They also own a ton of other stuff. They have lots of different studios outside of just Warner Brothers Pictures. They own New Line. They have Castle Rock Entertainment. There's a lot of companies that WarnerMedia is a part of, and that's not even touching on some of the newer media as far as the digital services, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But Warner Brothers is a very, very, very large company, and they just recently were acquired by AT&T in the past couple of years, and that means that they have even more money behind what they could potentially do. That's not to say that they have an unlimited budget or anything, but this is something that clearly the parent company of WarnerMedia, AT&T, wants to be successful, and their stockholders want to be successful, because the company as a whole, AT&T, is, while a major company that's been around for a very, very long time, some people say that they are undervalued. The opportunity for AT&T to exceed outside of the telecommunications aspect and the ISP aspect of different things, this is a big deal for them, and they really need the acquisition, which cost over $100 billion. They need this acquisition to go very well for them. Let's just say that. So, and obviously from the Warner Brothers standpoint, you don't want this to turn into another AOL situation where AOL went and bought Warner Brothers in the early 2000s, and then in turn, AOL eventually became defunct because it was phased out and it became just a footnote in the history of this company. So, that all being said, Tony, what is your familiarity with HBO products, Warner Brothers products, outside of what I've already discussed?
Well, I did not know that AOL owned WarnerMedia. That is an interesting piece of trivia. Well, back in the day of AOL and dial-up and good days. So yeah, HBO products, really just more the comic side. I mean, like, I know Warner Brothers puts out a bunch of movies. I know they put out a bunch of cartoons that I watched as a kid. I watch a lot of the CW shows, comic book fan. And, the CW Arrowverse shows could be better, but they're a fun hour. So if I've spent an hour during the week, it's a little bit fun to watch. Really, so I mean, besides like I have a casual, relationship with HBO, I know about the company and stuff like that. Game of Thrones. So Dustin, I'm not a bandwagon person at all. And for the longest time, everyone's like, Game of Thrones is the best. And it's like, I'm going to call that BS. But I was wrong. Checked it out, binged all like first 7 seasons all at once, preparing for the 8th. And all the 8th didn't end like I kind of wanted to. It's still a great series, and it kind of put in my eye, like, okay, HBO is like the next level. I remember as a kid, 1, I was kind of poor. 2, like HBO had, it's not on cable, so it doesn't follow the same FCC restrictions. So my parents were like, yeah, HBO is bad. It's got bad content. Yeah, for the longest time, it was like HBO and Starz, they have a lot more mature stuff that I couldn't watch. But now I can, so it's been a lot of fun. And that's kind of my relationship with it. The next thing I'll probably check out from HBO, though, is the new Watchmen series. Then after that is the new Game of Thrones. But yeah, a very casual relationship with the company.
As far as HBO specific, I've watched a number of different shows. I still watch a number of different shows that are on HBO. The one show that I watch pretty regularly because it's on more than just for the regular 10-episode season is Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, which is, I find, pretty amusing because a take on current events, but very in the same. Exactly. It's very much in the same vein as like the Daily Show, but it's only once a week, so there's less commitment to following along with what's going on, and which is nice because I don't have a ton of time to pay attention to politic news and things like that because I'm too busy keeping up with too many other news-related subjects. So I would say that that's the show I watch. But like I watched Game of Thrones. My wife was the one who convinced me to watch that. I just basically, she told me what it was about, and I was like, okay, let's give it a try. And I have no problem. I generally, if she tells me something's going to be pretty good, then I know it's going to be pretty good because she is one of those people where she reads a lot of books, so she knows the source material. She has a good understanding of what to expect, so that's always a plus. But
that could be a totally different conversation right there. I was surprised to hear that since she reads a lot of books, she'd like the TV show version of Game of Thrones.
Well,
I have a lot of book reading fans who really complain about it.
Well, no, to be fair, it was not that at all that she thought that the show was true to the books or anything like that. It was the show was coming. She had read the books. She really, really enjoyed the books. And she was like, we should check out this show. And I was like, okay. And the first episode aired. We watched. I was like, wow, that was pretty good. I would enjoy watching this. Let's watch it. As time progressed and we watched more and more seasons released, she became less and less thrilled with the direction of certain characters. And occasionally she would tell me like, oh, this character's left out completely. And I would be like, oh, well, tell me more. But then eventually, as we all know, Game of Thrones eventually the show surpassed the book series, and then they were kind of coasting on their own ideas instead of rather the source material. So that presented its own separate problems.
Totally different podcast.
Yes. But, Game of Thrones. HBO. Yeah, Game of Thrones. I'm looking forward to Watchmen 2. I do watch... currently, I'm watching Ballers and Righteous Gemstones. Ballers is actually just about to end. It's only got a couple episodes left. So
that's with The Rock, right?
Yep, with The Rock, yeah. And,
it's interesting. I've read they have a couple interesting guests, like real athletes as the guest stars. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. The other thing that HBO has a tendency, the HBO company by themselves, they've had a tendency to get a lot of really good high profile talent because they have the budget for it. So you'll see shows like Big Little Lies, which is a series that had Nicole Kidman, Reese Witherspoon, and those are very big high profile names when it comes to to movies, but to get them for a television show, it's a whole different story. Meryl Streep, I believe, was in the first season too, which, I mean, when somebody talks about going from film to television, you want to go the HBO route because HBO has a certain sense of quality. We talked about in the Apple Plus episode or Apple TV Plus episode, talked about how the assumption is that Apple is trying to go in the direction of HBO, where they're trying to nail down these real high-profile creators and high-profile actors and actresses to be in the projects and to be linked to their projects with the hope to produce really good quality content like HBO does. Of course, we're talking about HBO Max, though, which is going to include way more than just the HBO content that we all are aware of if you're aware of HBO. A lot of the content, the other content that you're going to see, well, at least from their teaser video that they showed back in July, there was a teaser video that showed that they said that there was going to be content from TNT and TBS and Adult Swim, Cartoon Network, Boomerang, Crunchyroll. There was other content from some of the other digital services that they have, Rooster Teeth. But then on top of that, you have the film studios. You have the DC stuff. You have New Line. You have Castle Rock. You've got Warner Brothers Pictures. Then you've got HBO. There's a lot of content that is going to be part of this because while it has the name HBO, which will by itself is an established name, because currently, this was an interesting fact, HBO currently has 140 million subscribers worldwide. And that's the HBO service. That means anybody who's subscribing to it, whether it be through HBO Now, which is a standalone service that you don't need to have a subscription to a cable service to have. They have 5 million subscribers as of 2018 for HBO Now. But 140 million people subscribe to HBO worldwide, which is a really, really large number when you compare it to some of the other companies that exist. That's only about 15 million or between 15 to 20 million less than Netflix has worldwide. And of course, the difference is that HBO has been around for a very, very long time. It's been around since the 80s, when it was back to be a home box office, where people were subscribing specifically, not necessarily for original content, but more for the ability to watch movies very, very soon after they were in theaters. And
to play devil's advocate, that's a different type of subscriber audience. It's not.
Oh, right.
It's not part of like the modern, get my iPhone out, binge watch. It's a different. It's like, ESPN, where it's like, yeah, it's a subscriber based, but it's a different type of thing that's going on. So.
Exactly. And by no means am I trying to compare 140 million subscribers, the way they have them, to what Netflix has, because it's not the new version of media. It's the old version of media. And it's more to prove how established the name of HBO is. There's a lot of people across the world that know what HBO is and subscribe. So that's the biggest
thing. This actually
thing.
Reminds me of an interesting debate that me and you have had off the air is should WarnerMedia, AT&T labeled their new streaming service after HBO, specifically HBO Max? I remember we had the discussion.
Yes. Yeah, let's just have that right now. I mean, like,
I know.
Should they have named it HBO Max? To be fair, I thought that they were going to go Warner something, because Warner Brothers has been the company that has been around the longest. And while HBO was its own thing, it doesn't have the longevity of the name Warner Brothers. And while it's no longer called Warner Brothers, it's called WarnerMedia, the reality of it is that the company has been around a lot longer. The over-encompassing name, of course, also has to do with the fact that while HBO has this established presence within, like, at least being known, the reality is that Warner Brothers has always been the parent of all of these other companies, including the Turner products and a lot of the other things like DC, and they're all part of Warner, not HBO. The decision to go with that name is an interesting choice, and the only thing I can think of is they went that decision and they went that route because HBO is a very well-known brand, and they thought it could carry the service well or better than Warner Brothers. And I'm guessing it has to do with the quality of content that is associated with Warner Brothers, and that's part of the reason why they're going the route that they are.
Well, it's better than the name Peacock.
That's true. Hands down.
And what are you thinking? I think it is, because the quality of content that HBO's had over the years, it for the longest time, HBO and Starz and Showtime, I think those are the three big ones. They consistently lead in the awards of best TV shows, best performances and actors for, cable television shows, even for like some of the movies too. They've always put out good content. Now it's one of those where everyone might not see it because it's maybe a little bit too mature for some people, but they put out great content, and you have that established brand to it. It's like, oh yeah, HBO is the home of Game of Thrones, Ballers, all these like very well praised shows, and it's like, okay, well, HBO is going to have the service. They're going to add more content. Like, I'll hold on to that. So I think it's a smart marketing play by WarnerMedia, knowing that they are decidedly at a disadvantage in terms of time. I mean, to talk about like their DC universe, the DC side of their streaming service that they launched, like, that's kind of, I wouldn't really classify as a success. It's not really a failure either. But you can, even with how slow that's been going on, and then you have HBO Max, which is coming out after Disney. We want to say it's a rival between these two companies. It's coming after Disney, and so that's also not a good thing. It's after Apple. So I think naming it HBO Max is a smart play, a smart marketing play. I think that's a well-known brand. I don't think a lot of people realize that yeah, like New Line is under Warner Brothers, DC is under Warner Brothers, all these other properties under Warner Brothers, because the WB, it's like, well, I know that they do movies, but whatever. Apple is a big brand name, Disney is a big brand name. Okay, well, HBO is a big sexy brand name, let's use that. So I'm in favor of it, long story short.
I think we're pretty much on the same page. I think initially I was kind of taken aback by the name, but I think now time has passed where I've warmed up to it because it makes more sense from a business standpoint. Mostly because initially I was looking at it from the perspective of, does the name HBO Max really feel like it's all encompassing all these other brands that have never really been associated with HBO? And that was my biggest hang up on it. But I mean, I especially now doing more research for this episode, on top of just, building a better knowledge base for this podcast, it comes down to, it's nice to know where they're coming from a business standpoint and understanding it. So there's that. Outside of the name, there's a couple of other things that are kind of interesting to bring up. So I want to talk about this because this is very interesting to me. So initially, when they announced that they were going to be doing a streaming service, now this was not necessarily before, it was after Disney had already announced that they were doing theirs, but they made a big deal about how they were going to do it. Initially, they announced it as it was going to be a 3-tiered system. They didn't explain what the tiers were. They didn't say what the prices were going to be, but they specifically said it was going to be a 3-tiered system and that some aspect of it was going to be ad-supported. Now, for the longest time, they made this announcement back in October of last year, so just over a year ago. At the time when they announced this, it was very interesting because, as I pointed out earlier, which we're going to get into in a little bit here, not HBO, but WarnerMedia owns a lot of other streaming services. And the streaming services, the other ones that they own and are already out there, are much smaller, much more niche services in the sense that they appeal to a very, very specific audience. If you like anime, you get this one. You like old cartoons, get this one. You like comic books, you get this one. That's the way a lot of their other services work. And I thought to myself, well, the idea of the tiered system is they want to include the stuff that's HBO. They can't drop the price of HBO in general because of how it works with the existing cable providers, with the market that they're already in. They can't drop the price significantly. So they offer a tier where you have an ad-supported system where you can watch a lot of the stuff, and it's a lower price system that can compete with a lot of these other services that are existing. And obviously we didn't know the price point for Disney Plus or Apple TV Plus at the time, which are very, very low, but more in the lines of competing with the lower end side of Netflix or a low-end subscription of Hulu. So all of that being said, then the middle tier I assumed was going to be the one where it would be more of the mid-range, probably like $12, $13, $14, and that would include basically everything but not be ad-supported. And then the higher tier would have HBO content because HBO is a premium service and it costs a premium amount of money. So that was the intent. But some point it changed. And when they came back to the table basically in July, they said, well, to be fair, they never actually said that they were completely getting rid of the tiers, but all industry analysts that were talking about it at the time said, well, they're not doing tiers, they're doing a single price, and everyone is expecting it to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $16, $17 because it's going to include everything. Because their video that they released hyping up the service showed that it was all-encompassing service. So you can't say it's HBO Max and not include HBO, at least in some regard. At the same time, can you really have an HBO or a service that includes the quality content that HBO provides that has always been ad-free and somehow pair it with ads? No, because it downplays the quality of what they're doing and what that brand has stood for. So at some point it shifted, and they announced that it was shifting back in July, around the same time that they announced that they were getting the streaming rights to Friends and as well as Big Bang Theory. And then on top of that, they announced some other deals that they had in place specifically with Greg Berlanti and Reese Witherspoon, where they would be producing a number of different shows or films for the service over time. They also announced some of the older content that would be coming to the service, but a lot of it was just part of the announcement video. So the question is, I know we had talked about this when they announced this, because we've been following this stuff for a long time. Even though we've just started this podcast, we've been talking about this stuff for a long period of time. How do you feel about them changing from the tiered system to, at least as far as we know now, an all-encompassing system?
I like it. I mean, I think more content's a good problem to have. I'm worried about the price. We're getting a lot. We're getting a lot of things with WarnerMedia, and I'm worried about the price. Disney's coming out $6. Apple's coming out with $5. Netflix is around, 10 to 11, depends the lower tier. That's kind of where the market is right now. I'm worried that HBO is going to be on the higher end of the market, and they're already at a disadvantage. The name HBO is only going to get them, so far. Yeah, I'm just worried. I think it's going to have too high of a price. There's one thing that we haven't really talked about, but I think it's going to help this conversation is you mentioned how, Warner Brothers has all these auxiliary streaming services. I think, I never want people to lose their jobs, but sometimes, if people always think these corporate, these corporate buyouts are bad and, everyone loses jobs, like that does suck. I'm going to recognize that. But I think it's, good for WarnerMedia to sometimes have a moment to be like, okay, where are we as a company? And yeah, you have an outside force that comes in, looks at your company, it's going to restructure. Usually restructuring is a bad idea. No one likes it. But in terms of WarnerMedia, I think it's going to be good because with this new service, they can consolidate a lot of their services and bring that all into just one service so that WB, WarnerMedia isn't like abiding that cost of keeping up and maintaining and paying people for all these different services when you can just put them all in one. So I think from the consolidation standpoint, it's going to save, WarnerMedia, AT&T a lot of money so that cost isn't offset on the consumer. But I am still worried that it's going to be on the higher tier. And that's just another thing that's another obstacle for WarnerMedia to overcome.
I mean, I guess now's the best time to tackle some of these other services that they offer. So outside of the fact that they have HBO Now, like as I said earlier, they already have 4 million or 5 million subscribers with that service. That's basically if you want to watch HBO, but you don't have cable, that would be your avenue of being able to watch HBO. You just pay it up front, and I believe it's $15 per month at this point. On top of that, you've got, I'm not going to go into every single one of the ones because there's a lot of them, but there's a lot of services that they offer as far as the services that are linked to your cable provider. So, for example, HBO On Demand, in the sense of it's called HBO Go. It's a standalone app where basically you use your login information from your ISP, and in turn, then you have access to the entire HBO library. They have those for a lot of the different stations or a lot of the different channels that they actually own, but I'm not going to go over every single one of those because you get the idea. But the other ones, so they have Cinemax, which also offers Max Go, which is the same idea of it being a standalone service that you pay and you have access to Cinemax content. They have Rooster Teeth, which is a more online media company that produces a wide variety of different content. They're best known for the Red versus Blue series. There's Boomerang, which is very inexpensive in the sense of for the amount of content that you get, it's actually very inexpensive. It's $4, but they have over 10,000 episodes of content from all kinds of old Hanna-Barbera cartoons, old Warner Brothers cartoons, old MGM cartoons. They have a lot of content on there for the price that you get. So any Scooby-Doo, the only content that's not on there that's part of those properties is they don't have any of the superhero stuff, because a lot of that stuff is over on another service called DC Universe, which not only offers streaming on-demand options to watch, but it also offers a very large library of comic books from DC Comics to read. And that price is a little bit higher, but in the sense of compared to some of the other smaller streaming services, but the library is a huge thing that you don't get with any of the other services. They also have Crunchyroll, which specializes in producing anime. They own Verve, which Verve is a service that connects a lot of the other smaller ones like Boomerang, Rooster Teeth, Crunchyroll. They also have they have streaming rights to a lot of other older 90s cartoons from Nickelodeon and some other things. They have like their own special individual channels within the service itself. But then there's also CW Seed, which is they own 50% of that along with CBS, and that's basically exclusive online content specifically made for the CW, but doesn't actually air on the CW. So there's some animated shows that tie into some of these shows that are already existing, as well as original properties. But then on top of that, there's also DirecTV Now, which just recently changed its name to AT&T TV Now, which is you can buy a service without having to have cable, where you just have access to channels on television. Needless to say, when you look at the larger parent company, there's a lot of services that HBO offers. As Tony was saying, a lot of these companies could easily be consolidated if they're all under the same banner of, hypothetically, HBO Max, which, quite honestly, I feel like that's the direction for a lot of these. Because while individually these services are creating content, if they were part of a larger service, they could still create content, focus on creating content, and focus less on the back end of things and the business side of things. They could just focus on creating, content for the service. So if you were to add up a lot of the services that they offer, if you were paying $16, $17, it's a really good price. But as Tony pointed out, it's still a price that is very high in comparison to everything else that's out there. Peacock has specifically stated that they will have ad-supported something, a tier or support or something in the sense of keeping the price down. There has not been talk at all about ad support at all within HBO Max ever since this announcement back in July. So I completely agree with the idea of consolidating things. I mean, I don't want people to lose their jobs either, obviously, but at the same time, when you're going into a service like this, the alternative, of course, is that you can no longer have the content at all. Now, that's not to say you have to get rid of the smaller services at all. You can consolidate them down to the original content can be found on the larger platform, and if people don't want to pay for the larger platform, they could still subscribe to the smaller service for their more niche specific service that they want to get their content from, but there will still need to be a reason. Back when it was a tiered system, the idea of a tiered system where you could have these other services, you could just tack them on for maybe a couple extra bucks and get the content and save yourself some money if you were subscribing to the larger service. That is not the direction that does not seem to be the direction that they're taking at this point. So I would say, by all means, consolidate some of this stuff because there's a lot of content. And on top of that, just browsing through the original content that they have already listed specifically for it, there's a bunch of shows that they have planned that they've talked about for quite some time. But as I was doing some research, I found out that WarnerMedia also just made a long-term deal with BBC Studios where after basically the entire catalog of BBC properties, Doctor Who, Luther, Top Gear, the British version of The Office, and all of that stuff is going to be available on HBO Max, as well as the future seasons of Doctor Who after they initially run on BBC America. So they're making deals on top of the massive amount of content that they already have. They've secured streaming rights for The Big Bang Theory and Friends, which was a huge deal. There's a lot of content that they have, and they're not holding back on potentially getting more content outside of the realm of what they have as well, which is a big deal. Because when you compare that to somebody like Apple TV Plus, which doesn't want to get any outside content, it's like night and day.
Yeah, I didn't know about the Doctor Who thing. I had so many friends in college who tried to binge watch Doctor Who, all crazy amount of seasons, and I applauded them, thought they were crazy. But there are a lot of people who are into Doctor Who, and that's a great property to have. Going back a few episodes, and we talked about Disney and how they bought all these different companies that they bought, and you look at who they are as a company. They're a brand company. They have these brands that will make their money. And I think that getting these types of shows, Friends, Doctor Who, you have all of the DC collection, all of the old WarnerMedia collection, Boomerang, and all that stuff. Those are all different brands. I think that's where people need to start going. If I remember correctly, we had a conversation a while back where we were talking about Warner Brothers. Wow, Warner Brothers. They license a lot of their content out to these other studios, and I think that's going to bite WarnerMedia in the butt for a little bit until they get, because when they wrote those contracts, they weren't thinking about the streaming age. They weren't thinking about, hey, we're gonna have our own service and provide this content ourselves. The old contracts were, all right, let's just get it out there, sign these deals, get advertising money, syndication, stuff like that. So Warner Brothers, in 5 years, we're going to have this discussion, and I think they're going to be a much better place because they can offer all their different content. Like another show that we were talking about, that's another DC show, is the Alfred Pennyworth show, and that's on like Epix. And we had a conversation, like, well, why would Warner Brothers do that when they're going to launch their own service? And you were like, well, I mean, they license out all of their content, and that's how they make a good chunk of their money. And
well, it's not so much about them licensing out their content. Warner Brothers primarily, for a very long time, has been a very two-tiered company. They obviously they have their movies, which is the one tier, but then the other part of it is, which is very, very big and very, very lucrative for them, which is the TV side of things. Warner Brothers produces a massive amount of shows, and a lot of people don't realize that Warner Brothers is one of the few companies that has shows on every major network that's out there. They have shows on CBS, they have shows on NBC, they have shows, ABC might be the one that they don't have anymore, but they used to. They have obviously shows on the CW, which is that they have shows on Fox. They produce content for these stations, and then these channels will pay money to Warner Brothers for them to have the content. And the thing is,
they have the streaming rights for that though?
Well, that's
that's
going to be different based off of what it is, because the thing is, for the longest time, I think any channel that was paying for the distribution of the show, in the sense of, I'm going to air this on my channel, they're paying Warner Brothers a fee to basically have the ability to show this show. For the longest time, it was just that channel would also have it. So like if the show ended up on Hulu, there might be a split on the ad revenue from from a show being watched on Hulu, where the original station gets X amount of percentage and Warner Brothers gets the other half. The thing is, there's so much content that Warner Brothers produces that they'll automatically run into a problem where if they stop producing content that they can sell to the other stations because they're focused on their own service, it's going to take away a bunch of money from their pockets. So they're in a predicament where the Big Bang Theory is a good example. They paid about $600 million to get the streaming rights for the exclusive streaming rights for The Big Bang Theory. Now, you also got to keep in mind that these shows are also in syndication. So and that's where a lot of shows make a lot of money, is in syndication. If a show's in syndication, there's numerous channels that are paying individual, regional areas, or they're paying individual amounts of money per region to Warner Brothers, the original production company for the service. It's the same thing it's why you see reruns of Big Bang Theory or Seinfeld or Friends on so many different stations. The Office, exactly. It's because they're paying money because they know that these shows bring people in, just like how these shows have demanded so much money. Just in the last couple of months, we've heard deals about how The Office is going to be switching over to NBC Universal, and they paid an enormous amount of money. It's because these shows, because they're so well known, they bring in a huge amount of people because of just the knowledge of this show being on that service. It brings people in. It's why Netflix churned out $100 million just to keep Friends on the service for an additional year. It's what's happening now. So, I mean, the thing is, I definitely agree that everything is changing, and Warner Brothers has to kind of just stick to their guns and start focusing more effort on creating content for not just their streaming service, but specifically their networks that they specifically own, the Turner Networks, CW. And they have to do that because that's the only way they're going to be able to kind of make these other companies look for content. I mean, if you're producing, and this is not a real number, I'm just making this up, but if you're producing, if you're NBC and 50% of all of your shows are made by one specific studio, and that studio decides, well, we're not going to make you any more shows, they've got to go figure out a way to make shows for themselves. That ultimately will eat away money that they could be putting towards their own streaming service. So there's that side of things, but I mean, honestly, that's a discussion for a whole nother episode.
Yeah, you kind of, it was more of a leading question because I remember the conversation. I was like, I think he can explain this a little bit better than I can about the whole like licensing ordeal.
Because Warner Brothers, I mean, like, they make a lot of money. And I remember back in May, there was a discussion with the content exec who, does a lot of the programming for a lot of the different stations like TBS and TNT. And he specifically was asked, like, so what's the deal with, you guys producing content for other people? And he said, well, we're still in the business of making content, so that's not going to change. And I thought to myself, Warner Brothers has always, in some ways, double dipped. They have their own networks that they have their shows on, and they have their shows on other networks. So who's to say they don't produce content for other streaming services because they can do it in a way that they can make money from it on top of, and then use the profits from that in, to better their own service. It's honestly going to happen. I mean, obviously the only thing that's probably going to change is the amount of output because of all these services that are popping up. The opportunities for more content will be there because, let's be honest, a lot of the cable stations that exist, the content that's there isn't stuff that's super sought after. So if you have a streaming service where you're paying a premium price, you're going to want high quality content that's going to bring, subscribers in.
Couldn't said it better.
Yeah. So the only other thing I wanted to bring up was this is another kind of in this vein of BBC, and I do want to correct myself. I said they're going to have all the streaming rights to Doctor Who. It's actually from 2005 forward because that's when BBC actually owned all of Doctor Who. The previous seasons from, back years and years ago are not directly owned by BBC. They're owned by, I believe, a different production company. But in the same vein, if you're a media fan and you are a movie fan, you probably have heard of the Criterion Collection. And years ago, there was a service called Filmstruck, and Warner Brothers owned it, and the Criterion Collection had a lot of movies that were on there, and that Filmstruck service very abruptly shut down, and there was a lot of high-profile directors who were asking Warner Brothers to start it back up, not shut it down, because it did wonders for a lot of independent and short films and things like that. And I mean, when I say high-profile, I mean there was a lot of Oscar-nominated, Oscar-winning directors who were requesting that they turn this service back on. And ultimately what ended up happening was they announced that the Criterion Collection would be part of the Criterion Channel, a standalone service that would launch in the spring of 2019. And they said in the initial press release that eventually it would get rolled into HBO Max as well. Well, they didn't say HBO Max at the time, but they said the Warner streaming service. So the idea is that, again, that's a lot of content out there that a lot of people at the time were asking for, that they plan on rolling into it. So the whole point of saying this is that they are not holding back on making sure that they have lots of content. I remember specifically something I saw said that they were going to have, over 10,000 episodes of different shows, which is, I feel like a low amount, because they have thousands and thousands of episodes of just the cartoons over on Boomerang. So there's a lot of content that they have that they may not have it all right away, but they will slowly roll it out. Because also the other part of it is, while they have lots of content, going back to the licensing thing, Hulu has specific Warner Brothers shows that are currently over there, and Netflix has shows that are over there. There's a lot of the CW shows are tied up over at Netflix until I believe the end of 2020. That's part of the reason why some of the newer shows they did not sign deals with Netflix, is because they are going to all eventually come over to that service. So the thing is, they are going to be planning for the future, as you had said earlier. by making sure that a lot of the content that the new stuff that they're producing is going to be available on their service, unless they're specifically making a specific deal for it appearing on a separate service, because that's the best way to make money nowadays. All that being said, October 29th is the date that we're going to need to be watching for, because that's going to be the date that they're going to be announcing a lot more details. And of course, we will be here to talk all about that stuff once it happens, and we will be discussing all of the finer details that they hopefully announce. And it's not just a slew of, here's a bunch of trailers for some shows that are coming. I'm really hoping for release date, pricing, more definition of what actually will be contained, because while we've seen, for example, Apple TV Plus and Disney, they have their own methods of how much content they're producing, but there's always this disconnect about what exactly is included, what will not be included, especially when you have a company like Warner Brothers that has so much content out there that a lot of people don't even realize has the Warner Brothers name on it. That's going to be important to clarify. So that's what I'm hoping for. All right. So with that being said, that is going to take us to the end of this episode. Real quick, if you are enjoying the show, we encourage you to leave a review on whatever podcast platform you're currently listening to the podcast. These podcasts are available on practically any service that you can think of. We've tried to get it on to every service we can imagine. It's also available on YouTube and SoundCloud. While there will be a little bit of a delay in SoundCloud for the first couple months due to the limit of content that we can actually publish on there, eventually we'll be completely up to date within the first couple months of the show. But on top of that, you can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com if you have a question, especially as we get closer to the normal episodes and our normal format of discussing hot topics and things like that. If you have questions that you'd like us to talk about, or topics you'd like us to briefly talk about, you can send those over to our email, and you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We try to post all of any new trailers that we see over on Twitter. We also have a Discord. The link is over on the site, where we're also posting a lot of the news articles that we're seeing as it happens. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest that's happening, check out all of those different things, different avenues of following along with not only us, but also the entire overall topic of the streaming wars. So with that being said, that is everything for this episode. For Tony and myself, we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.